Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining NEFE's last webinar of 2024, where we're going to be discussing state K-12 financial education requirements. So we're very excited to share more on this important topic, especially as there has been significant momentum and movement in this space in the last few years. So my name is Newberry. I'm the Managing Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the National Endowment for Financial Education. I will be facilitating Q&A at the end, while my colleagues on the Policy and Advocacy Team, Emma Donahue, Senior Manager, and Hunter Field, Manager, will be presenting the actual webinar. Did have a few housekeeping notes. So this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with registrants and posted on NEFE's YouTube channel for any sort of follow-up viewing. And we have also enabled live captioning settings for this webinar. So if you would like to turn this feature on, please go to the Zoom dashboard at the bottom of the screen and click Show Captions to toggle captions on so you can follow along with subtitles. We are also happy to share the slide deck and any sort of related materials for anyone interested to make sure you have all the resources you need to follow up with this webinar. So with that said, I will now turn it over to Emma to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Raven. So we are going to start off talking about K-12 financial education requirements, what's been happening in the past, what happened in 2024, and what we expect to see in the future. So before we jump into that, just a little bit about the National Endowment for Financial Education, or NEFE. Our mission is to champion effective financial education, and we do that through research and policy and advocacy tasks. We are a private operating foundation based in Denver, Colorado. And our mission is to, as I said, to champion financial effective education. We do that by funding research, which contributes to the body of knowledge around financial education, what works, what doesn't, and why isn't it working for everyone. Research is an underpinning of all of our work, and we disseminate that through the arms of our policy and advocacy partnerships and thought leadership work. If you want to learn more about other projects we are working on, check out nefe.org. For today's webinar, we are going to do an update on state K-12 financial education requirements, a look forward to what we think might happen in 2025, talk a little bit about our K-12 implementation position papers, the role of NEFE in this work, and then open it up to Q&A from our audience and see what you have questions about today. So to get started, we're just going to talk a little bit about our research first, since it is an underpinning a lot of our organization and the work that we do. We know largely that people are in favor of financial education, but what does the research and data say behind it? And what do we know about the impacts of financial education? First, we have there's better and more data on financial education than ever before. Research since 2015 has really exploded in this area. And we have more rigorous designs and randomized trials than ever to really look at and make sure that this financial education is really working for students. So according to a recent Kaiser meta-analysis of 76 independent financial education randomized experiments, the gains from financial education are similar in size and knowledge gains from math and reading interventions. That's a huge gain for students. On the impact of having it as a requirement for high school students, research has also shown that students in states with requirements have reduced borrowing on credit cards and have shifted from higher cost post-secondary financing options to lower cost financing options. That's great for students. We all know student loans are a huge burden right now, so helping prevent that in the future is always great. We also know that these requirements have big impacts on who gets financial education and can help even the playing field. Particularly with standalone personal finance courses, they're bound to expand access to Black and Hispanic students, and especially around female students who are less likely to engage in financial education when it is not required. So overall, we're seeing a huge explosion of great research that's really showing that financial education is working and working for students across the board. And so what we're going to jump into now is where are the requirements, what states have them, what's happening in that field, and what do we expect to happen going forward. So 26 states currently require a financial education course for students to graduate. That is of 2024, with California being our last state to join. As of 2019, there are only 6 states that had this same requirement. So that is a huge jump in a very short amount of time. So we're seeing a great amount of students who are being added into this requirement, who are getting this education, and who will be able to use it going forward. I do want to just clarify, there's a lot of ways to slice and dice a requirement. And so I want to say, just go over a little bit how NEFE views this. So in order for NEFE to view a state as having a full graduation requirement, that state must require that all students take at least a semester's worth of financial education. That can either be in a standalone semester's course, or it can be in a year-long course as long as 50% or more of the coursework is dedicated to financial education. We find, talking about that research again, that under that 50% mark, it just isn't getting students enough information to really make good financial decisions going forward. And so that is how we got to this 26 state number. Both CFPB and Next Gen Personal Finance also use this 26 number. So it is kind of seen across the board, but there are a few other numbers out there. So you might see others as you look into this topic a little bit more. So first, I want to show you a little bit where we are right now. This map, the teal is states that have a current requirement. So you see we've added in California already. So we got them nice and green now as well. So that was very exciting this year. The dark gray is for states that do not have any kind of requirement right now. And the light gray is for states that have a partial requirement. That can mean that they require financial ed, or financial education, but it's not a full semester's worth. It's integrated into an economics course. It's in some other form, but they are requiring students to take some sort of financial education. We also know that this isn't just a yes/no partials kind of issue. There is great financial education work going on in states, even with that don't have a requirement. We talk about here in Colorado where NEFE is based. Colorado does not currently have a full requirement, but we're seeing some districts adopt it, like Denver Public Schools requiring it for their students. So just because your state doesn't have a requirement or doesn't have a full requirement doesn't mean that there's not good work going on in that state, or ways for you to engage with advocates on increasing that requirement or helping the school districts roll it out well. So there's a lot of work going on across the board. And we're so just excited to see that this map is being filled in more and more every year. So kind of along with this map, I love this timeline because it really shows how much the momentum has grown and the big jumps that we have made. You can see the huge uptick from 2019, where we had 6 states, to now having 26 in 2024. So what else is happening? We've seen this big tick. We've had a lot of states jump on. But what happened in 2024? So in 2024, there were 12 states that introduced legislation at some point during the year, with only, unfortunately, California fully passing a full requirement this year. Outside of just the state level, the Department of Defense did pass legislation this year requiring that all Department of Defense run schools also have a graduation requirement for financial literacy. So that is adding about 66,000 students who wouldn't otherwise be getting financial literacy as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about what happened in 2024. So I want to highlight 2 big states who both took the financial education issue in kind of separate ways and had very different outcomes. So when we start here, we'll start with California because it was a big success for this year. California took it in 2 different directions. They had both legislation and a ballot measure at one point that were very similar, but were going different routes in order to get this requirement put into place. Ultimately, the ballot measure was pulled back by its sponsors once an agreement on the legislation was made, and the governor signed Bill 2927 on June 29th. This will add almost 2 million additional students who will be getting financial education going forward. So this is a huge bump in the amount of students actually receiving financial education, even with just 1 state this year. So this was a huge accomplishment for everybody who advocated for it, who have worked on it, either on the ballot measure side, the legislation side, advocating throughout California. It was a huge win for everybody there. New York, on the other hand, took a very different approach. They created the New York State Blue Ribbon Commission on Graduation Requirements. These requirements, this Blue Ribbon Commission was looking at graduation requirements as a whole. So not just financial literacy, but the entire graduation, how their diplomas worked, the entire process for high school students in New York. The Blue Ribbon Commission came out with strong recommendations for financial literacy to be a standalone course or a graduation requirement, with both about over 85% on both of those issues, really saying that this was a high priority. Unfortunately, the New York State Department of Education, when they announced their final plan for overhauling their graduation requirements, decided that financial literacy would not be a graduation requirement, but would stay just as a required standard, which is similar to what is in the current graduation system. They did do a few additions where they now are allowing financial literacy to count as an elective. It can count towards a required CTE graduation requirement or a required math graduation requirement. So there are additional ways for financial literacy to count towards graduation for students, but it is not being required for all students to take in order for them to graduate from high school. There is, it is a long, complex process. They might make some additions along the way, but at this point, from what the plan that has been released is, this is what we're seeing for New York. So those are two very different ways at looking at how to make a graduation requirement happen, and two very different outcomes for these two states. So we also want to look at just there was a lot of legislation across the board on what was introduced this year. So we can see all these states had graduation requirement bills that were introduced. Some of them were just introduced and never moved more than that through the process. Some of them moved a lot, barely through the process, but ran into issues along the way. If you would like a more in-depth view of what several of these states did for their legislation in 2024, you can check out our legislative review for 2024 on NEFE.org. And that will allow you to just get a little more in-depth on what happened in each of these states. I do also have New York also, along with having their Blue Ribbon Commission, did introduce several pieces of legislation. Those bills mostly did not move forward because they were waiting to see what the Blue Ribbon Commission recommended and what ultimately the New York Department of Education would decide to do. So, but there is interest on the legislative side there as well. And our last one, I want to talk a little about Washington. Washington had two very strong bills in both the House and the Senate that had a lot of support in there for districts, for teachers, using their public-private partnership to really support the legislation. Those bills ultimately did not go forward because a last-minute amendment to remove the graduation requirement aspect of the bill, which was a big part of why people wanted it to get passed, and so it ultimately stalled out. So we hope that Washington will relook at this again. We also know that Washington is looking at, has created a Futures Ready program that will be also overviewing their whole graduation requirements over the next couple of years, and have heard that there will be a possibility of a subcommittee dedicated to financial literacy as part of that project. So they're definitely still talking about it a lot in Washington from a lot of different angles. And so there's a lot of excitement happening in there as well. So a couple of states that didn't quite pass the full requirement, but they passed some legislation this year. So New Mexico also had a bill that did an overview of their graduation requirements. They also wanted to look at it to make sure that graduation requirements were working for students, for districts, and that were in a way that was really helping students get the most out of their education. Ultimately, amendment was proposed to put in a graduation requirement for financial literacy, but that amendment was not accepted. And so that were not able to move forward with a full graduation requirement, but they are strengthening some of their financial literacy in New Mexico as well. Oklahoma, which has long had the financial literacy passport, has been doing a lot of work in this area. They're not quite to a full graduation requirement yet, but they're getting closer every year. Last year, they passed two bills. House Bill 2158 required that financial education be taught as a half-unit course, but that half unit can be embedded, integrated, or a standalone course. So that is why it doesn't quite meet our requirements for a requirement. The legislation does allow it to be offered as a standalone elective if schools want to it, and we really hope that school districts will take this opportunity to provide it as a standalone course for students, since that is an option. House Bill 3278 adds personal finance to the list of math courses that can count towards a math graduation requirement. So again, it's making financial education, even if states don't have a full requirement for it as a standalone course, but making it count towards other requirements does help get more students taking that course, since it is helping them move along in their graduation plans. And they are getting credit towards needed courses while still getting this very valuable education. So we do want Oklahoma to show that they are doing some great stuff. They're moving forward, and we're hoping that because of the options allowed under this legislation, that more school districts will take this opportunity to move into a standalone course for students. So what's happening next? We've heard a little bit about 2024, but where do we want to go next? So these are all states that there have either legislation was introduced last year, or we've heard that there is interest and desire to move some legislation this year. So we'll talk about Colorado, since that's where NEFE is, our home state. We've heard that there is some legislation coming this session that would be a full requirement. Obviously, we have not seen any of the legislation or any of the details about these bills, so I don't have any details about exactly what these states are looking at. But this is just kind of an overview of what we expect might come. Wish I had a crystal ball and knew everything that was going to happen. So Maine had legislation last year that was not able to get across the finish line, but they have some strong sponsors there who are really looking at pushing forward this again. Texas is one of the states, as if we think back to that map, that was a partial state. They have some standards in their requirements right now, but they don't have enough to really require it as a full course. So we're hoping that they'll be able to move from having strong standards into actually requiring it as a full standalone course. Delaware has some great legislation last year that we hope gets reintroduced and is able to move forward. Massachusetts, technically, while still in session, has several bills still pending. But the session is dwindling quickly, so we expect that this might have to be a next session conversation again, and hope that they're able to work from the conversations they had this year into making some strong bills for next session. And then, as I mentioned, Washington has several things going on right now. They had great legislation last year. There's talk that there might be legislation this year. There's also the Future Ready program coming out of the State Board of Education, which might, make it so legislation doesn't happen this year, but that they're looking at a more holistic view and will come up with a stronger system overall. And we hope, that financial education is a big part of that, if that's how they decide to move forward. So and I'm not saying that we're limited to these states. This is just states we have heard things or had a lot of movement last year on. We've had times where states have come out of nowhere, introduced legislation, it passed, and they move forward with a requirement. So just because your state is on here does not mean, or your state is not on here, does not mean something might not happen, and you might not want to get engaged with what's happening on the ground level there as well. And so just to wrap up a little bit, so we've talked about what has happened, a lot since 2019, but what's happened with states in the last, couple decades. We talked about last year. We talked a little bit about what we think might happen next year, but wanted to wrap this up of why are people talking about financial education so much? Why is this such an important topic? Why are we seeing this huge jump in states wanting to pass this requirement, wanting to make sure students have that? And a lot of it is because public sentiment is there. From a 2022 poll that NEFE fielded, 88% of respondents said that their state should require a semester or year-long financial education course for graduation. We can't get 88% of people to agree on many things, let alone policy. So this is a huge support number that really shows that financial literacy is not a partisan issue. It goes across the board, and is really something that people view as a strong life skill. So a lot of it is public sentiment, but what else has led to this huge surge in states in the last, 3-4 years? Unfortunately, financial education usually gets a lot of support after an economic downturn or a time of economic uncertainty. People realize that they're not prepared to handle maybe financial issues. They want their kids or students to be better prepared to handle financial uncertainty or outcomes as they go forward. So a lot of it, unfortunately, does happen with downturns, but it also happens for good reasons too. As I talked about at the beginning, since 2015, we've had a huge swell in research that has really shown the efficacy, the effectiveness, all of the reasons why we should be teaching this to students. So there's just more research out there supporting it that policymakers can take well and use to help support their legislation. Huge groundswell efforts, advocates, organizations, individuals have been talking about this, working on this issue for decades, and their work is paying off. Their constant drive to make sure that this is a part of students' education is really being seen across the board. And some part of that effective advocacy work and the groundswell is that states don't want to be left behind. They don't want to be the last one to provide this to their students. So we're seeing some states who want to make sure that they're not leaving their students behind when states around them are doing well. So there's many reasons why we've seen a big jump in these states actually adopting these policies, and we are excited to hopefully get more states. The goal is eventually every state, every student gets this education, and we are on a strong track to do that. I'm now going to hand this over to Hunter to talk to us a little more about some other work we're doing here at NEFE and around this issue.
Thanks, Emma. Appreciate that. And so we were just discussing the momentum behind these graduation requirements, right? And looking at some of the reasons why we are seeing this groundswell effect. But what happens in these states after the requirements pass, right? Generally speaking, legislation, administrative rules, in the rare instances that these requirements are passed through administrative rules, they're not very prescriptive. And most often the implementation is handed off to state agencies and their partners, typically the State Department of Education. The first step that states normally take after this requirement is passed is going through their standards on financial education and either adopting some if they don't have them or revising the ones that they already have on the books. Many states that don't have requirements do have standards for financial education. Typically, these are taken from the national standards with some tweaks here and there based on state to state. But that is the first step, is just looking at these standards, making sure that we have the right foundation and that we know what specific topics are going to be taught to students in the classroom. From there are numerous other issues that come into play, and this is where the implementation timeline comes up. So after a law passes, generally we will see a timeline of approximately 4 to 5 years where states will first move through revising standards, like I mentioned, typically over the course of the first year. But after that, it's about addressing needs such as teacher training, making sure that we have proper curriculum and resources and other supports for our teachers. And so that typically takes a few years. Like I said, about 4 to 5 years. And so the first graduating classes are down the road, when these requirements get passed. The first graduating classes that are required to take this personal finance to graduate are not coming for a few years. And so, there's not instant gratification here, but it is a really important part of this implementation because it takes time to set up the resources and supports to make sure that this is effective financial education in the classroom. So even though it's a few years down the line, this is a necessary part to make sure that states have stable footing as they go into this new era of a requirement. And lastly, after the implementation process has gone on, we have our first graduating classes. From that point, it's really about revision and evolution. Just as with most things in life, it's not going to be perfect from the start, there will be areas of strength and areas that can be improved upon. And so once these graduating classes start going through and states are getting more feedback on what is and isn't working in the classroom, that's when we look at revision, evaluation, an important part that just goes on into the future indefinitely, right? Always working to improve and build upon our efforts on these requirements. And so we in the field had been hearing a lot about this process specifically. A lot of our work has been on advocating around the passage of these requirements and providing technical input to people at the state level, policymakers at the state level. But after these requirements are passed, there are state actors, the Department of Education folks are looking for more guidance on best practices and also examples from other states on what has and has not worked as they've gone through a similar process. Because of that, NEFE has set out over this past year on writing a series of white papers to address this specific issue. And so we want to look more at what recurring issues are coming up across states. We know, of course, that not every state is the same, but we wanted to provide this for the field just as a sort of guidance and providing insights into how states can go through their implementation process. And so looking at this slide, there were 4 key topics that really came into focus for us as we were doing this work, things that just came up time and time again through interviews and research that we were conducting. And that is teacher training, curriculum and resources, partnerships and collaboration, and evaluation. And so just to go through each of these points briefly and elaborate a little bit more, of course, when it comes to teachers, when this requirement passes, we are now seeing a new demand for teachers who are trained to teach the course, who are trained to teach personal finance. And that just means that there's going to be challenges around that, right? How are we going to facilitate that to the best possible way? How can we best prepare teachers so that when they go into the classroom, they feel comfortable with the material and also are empowered to the degree that they can be creative and innovative with the material to really engage with students. On a similar note, curriculum and resources, right? We now see a heightened demand for curated resources for teachers in the classroom. Even after they go through training, teachers still need a little bit of guidance, pointing them in the right direction on what resources are best to use, which ones match the standards that the state has implemented. And so that is a big thing that came up across the states that we were looking at. Partnerships and collaboration specifically comes up in the context of funding. That's really kind of the approach that we took when we were talking about this in the white papers. Funding is a critical component of this. At NEFE, we advocate for funding to be attached to these requirements when they are passed. That is the ideal situation, but there are, in most instances when these bills are passed, they do not have funding attached, or if they do, it's not necessarily sustainable in the long term, some short-term funding, and it needs to be supplemented on top of that to reach the need. So when we're talking about partnerships and collaboration, we're thinking about ways that we can bring public and private partners together into the same space, talk about gaps that there are, whether that's funding, professional development, or resources for teachers, or potentially evaluation, which I'll talk a little bit more about, filling in that gap and helping the state and school districts evaluate their efforts so that they can improve upon them. And like I said, evaluation was something that came up consistently, right? There isn't really a uniform approach that we saw across states, but one thing that we did hear, including from states that don't really have established evaluation practices, is that it's something that they want, right? It is a gap in what they're doing so far. And to what I said earlier, right, it's always about improving upon this. It's never going to be perfect when we first start. And so having evaluation tools in place is very important when we want to progress and evolve these requirements. And so on this slide, I wanted to take us back to the graph that we showed earlier, really showing this momentum in the field to show you the 4 states that we focused in on. The first one that was kind of an obvious choice, especially for those on this call who are, very familiar with the K through 12 financial education space, was of course Utah, a trailblazer on this front and the first state to pass a graduation requirement in 2003. Utah had their first graduating class in 2008. So, when we look at this graph, in terms of the information that they have on what is working, isn't working, they just have many more graduating classes that they can analyze in that sense. And so that was a great place to start. We figured, we want to look at Utah first as an example. And then you can see the three other states that we focused in on here. North Carolina, which passed a graduation requirement in 2019 and had their first graduating class this past spring. Similarly, Nebraska, which passed 2 years later in 2021, but also had their first graduating class this past spring under the requirement, of course. And lastly, we spoke with folks in Mississippi and looked at Mississippi, which uniquely passed their requirement through administrative rule. This was in 2020, and a little shorter timeline for Mississippi. Their first graduating class was only a couple years later in 2022. But part of the reason why I wanted to use this chart to talk about these four states is to really display, Nebraska was the last state that we analyzed for the white papers that had passed the requirement. And they were one of 3 states in 2021. But since then, since 2021, 16 additional states have now passed these requirements. And so the states that we were looking at, implementation has more or less gone through the process, right? Of course, evaluation, like I said, is kind of indefinite. That's always a process. But just in terms of their implementation window, these states have gone through that already. And now we see 16 states and ideally more to come who are going to be working through similar issues. And so I really just wanted to highlight that here. We hope that these white papers can help offer guidance and insight to these states which are now moving through implementation. And so I wanted to just highlight a few key findings from our position papers, from our white papers. I do just want to say these are not published yet. We are publishing these towards the beginning of next year, hopefully at the beginning of February. That said, after this webinar, we will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone. And so if you are interested in signing up to get a notification when we do publish those papers, that will be an option for you. So keep an eye out for that email that we send after the webinar. And you can sign up and get a notification and see the papers when we put them out. There are many more findings on each of these points that we had, but there were just a few that I wanted to highlight to provide a couple of examples of what we're really addressing in these papers. So the first one, which again, this is a topic that I've already touched on a few times in just the past few minutes, but when we look at teacher training, ensuring teachers are prepared and certified was something that really came to focus for us. Even in states where there is a very strong teacher training, like personal finance teacher training offering, there are many states that don't really have a level of accountability in ensuring that teachers have finished this professional development and are comfortable with the material in the classroom. We have seen a few examples of states that will look at an endorsement process or other sort of credentialing for teachers. But this was something that we really wanted to highlight in this paper. Yes, of course, teacher training is very important, the professional development itself, and we talk about that in this paper. But I did want to highlight the point about certification, because having a level of accountability and ensuring that teachers are certified or endorsed to teach this in the classroom, it's really important in achieving a level of uniformity. And when we talk about equity in access to effective financial education, that's a key component here as well. If there are certain school districts that are making sure that their teachers are certified, that they got a certain score on a professional development assessment or something of the sort, but other school districts nearby are not doing it, it's likely that the quality of teaching of the personal finance is not going to be the same in those classrooms. And so having a level of uniformity, though there are challenges to it, we think is very important. And so we elaborate more on that in our teacher training paper. In terms of curriculum, one point that I wanted to highlight here is curating resources to provide clarity for teachers. When NEFE, decades ago was a college, there were not as many resources and lesson plans on personal finance education out in the world. That is very different today. And one thing that we heard from, well, we continuously hear from teachers on the ground, but that we also heard in our research for these papers, is that the noise can be hard for teachers to sift through. It's great, of course, that there is such a wealth of resources and lessons plans and curriculum across the board and available for free in many instances. But teachers do need some guidance there. And so a couple of examples that we had seen, there are states that have actually crafted a full semester long course through Canvas, something that is very accessible for teachers. And, you know, when I mentioned Canvas, something that they're familiar with. And so that's, you know, that is an ideal that worked very well. Specifically, I'm thinking of Nebraska. But there are other examples as well, such as creating a website just where you can point teachers in the right direction for certain resources that align with the state standards, just to help them bridge that gap. Because again, you know, if teachers are just going out on Google and trying to find the best lesson plans, there is so much out there. It can really be hard to sift through. And so that's one of the points that we talk about in that paper that I wanted to highlight. With partnerships, I also had touched on this a little bit previously. We really wanted to focus on how this collaboration and these partnerships can help with sustainable and consistent funding. Even in the states where there is funding passed with a requirement, which again is not the norm, unfortunately, there is a need for supplemental funding in those instances. Specifically, I think of North Carolina, where the state did allocate funding, does allocate funding with a fundraising match from the Council on Economic Education there. And so I really just wanted to highlight that because it shows that even when we do have funding from the bill that establishes this requirement, there is a need for further funding. And so you can imagine in states that don't have allocated funding through the requirement to the legislation, there's a greater need for that from the private sector and also just from these partnerships. And so this is a way, through this collaboration, we saw a couple of examples of a state establishing a body like such as a council or a commission, could be housed in the Treasury Department, the Treasurer's office, something of the sort. Really, the point is bringing together voices and stakeholders, nonprofits, private partners like financial institutions into the same room and having these conversations about what are the gaps with our existing offerings? Like what can we really fill in? Do we need more teacher trainings? Are we not reaching the demand that we have? And you know, again, it's a great place, and we've seen successful stories of how private partners can hear these stories and, you know, intentionally fill in those gaps because it's presented to them in that way. Lastly, with evaluation, I mentioned, of course, this is something that is ongoing once these requirements actually take place and we have graduating classes. One thing that is so important here is having pre and post assessments, both for teachers and students alike. Now, I do, of course, want to address one point here that states should have caution with. Having students, like a student assessment that students are required to pass in order to pass the course and therefore graduate high school, that can be a tricky, you know, idea there, just because of this idea of boxing teachers in, teaching to the test. You know, we have heard from teachers themselves and in our research that allowing them the flexibility to really be creative with the material in a way that engages their students is very important. And, you know, if we box into teaching to a test, that can kind of undermine that creativity and flexibility for teachers. So I do just want to highlight that point as a caution. But generally speaking, having pre and post assessments around for teachers, their professional development, and for students for their course in high school, these are very important for measuring knowledge gains and seeing what is and isn't working. And additionally, you know, we also have research on this. You can track year over year the progress of your requirement. We know through research that once one of these requirements is passed, it only gets better as the years progress, right? And so this is a chance for states to not only quantify that progress, but also find areas, gaps of their offerings where they can improve and maybe see strengths, and they can take from those strengths for those areas of improvement to work through that as well. And so those are our white papers. Again, those will be coming out at the beginning of next year, and I encourage you all to take a look once we have those out. But I did just want to take a step back and kind of look at this from the big picture. What are opportunities for support? I'm sure many of you all on this call are from different backgrounds and work in different fields as it relates to financial education. And so these are just kind of some big picture points. Again, supporting teachers, just so important here. We obviously, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the restraints on teachers right now in the K through 12 space, the limitations on resources and financial supports for them in the classroom. I really just want to emphasize that teachers need support around this issue. I had seen someone ask in the Q&A about which teachers might be best qualified to teach this course, or where do we find them from? The reality is that in states all across the country, there are many different types of teachers who end up teaching this course. Math teachers, social studies teachers, CTE instructors. And so all that is to say that teachers need our supports in any way we can get. If that is funding professional development, if you're a financial coach or a financial planner, maybe there's a way that you can fit in there to help train teachers and support them, maybe even through your employer or your institution. And so I really wanted to highlight that part, and also say, when teachers get this training, we have research that this is something that not only are they now better equipped to teach it in the classroom, but they take that knowledge into their personal lives when they go home as well. And so there is a lot of benefit to come out of this training, and wanted to highlight that point because it really just shows how effective supporting teacher training can be for future generations, as well as just supporting teachers in their lives currently. In terms of financial education supports, when I think about programs and curriculum, this is something that we hear all the time, just providing guidance on what materials are best, and or supporting organizations that do work around curriculum and other programming. There are many organizations that have niche focuses on financial education programming and curriculum. And some of those organizations can be really great to support and help out. And I think that they bring a different perspective that is needed when we talk about this and when we talk about equity with effective financial education. And lastly, when Emma was talking about momentum in this space, she mentioned research, right? And we simply have more data that shows how effective financial education can be. And we've already seen just over the past few years in our work and with our advocacy that having these data points, quantifiable things that we can point to that show the impact of this, it just makes the job easier. There are states that are more likely to pass a requirement because there's more information showing that it helps students in their lives. And so to the extent that you can help expand research on effective financial education, not only does this help us actually improve our financial education practices, but if you're showing that this is something that is impactful and helping with the financial well-being of future generations, that will go a long way in terms of advocacy and making sure that we are expanding access to effective financial education. This last slide here, I just kind of wanted to give some perspective as to how we at NEFE on our policy and advocacy team fit into that last slide, and opportunities for support and where we're doing this work. Of course, elevating and expanding access to effective financial education is central to our mission at NEFE. And these examples on the slide are just a few of how our work as a policy team supports that mission. Of course, we are advocating for effective financial education constantly, and to anyone who's willing to listen, really anyone. As you know, it could be lawmakers, administrators, educators. Additionally, through our convenings, recently we had our second summit here in Denver to bring together various leaders in the field to help innovate and expand conversations around effective financial education, really pushing the envelope on, expanding thoughts around what works, what doesn't, how certain populations can be better addressed and engaged with this material. And so convenings like that can really help expand the conversation and also bridge connections between folks who are doing similar work, maybe on opposite ends of the country. Now, NEFE, of course, we cannot directly lobby on any living bills, but our team does field requests for information from lawmakers, and we also have provided guidance and research to states that are proceeding through implementation. A state might be thinking about their standards, which I mentioned earlier, or perhaps whether or not there should be a standalone or embedded course. And oftentimes they'll have stakeholder processes through that where they field testimony, and that is something that our team has been proactive on. And truly, if you have expertise on that area, that is an area in your state as it might come up where you can make an impact, have your voice be heard. And again, with the research that we can point to, that can be pretty convincing in certain ways. We also, of course, analyze financial education legislation. A lot of Emma's slides from earlier in this webinar are from our 2024 legislative review. Highly recommend you go check that out. If you have not, I believe the link is in the chat. And lastly, of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention our amazing research team here at NEFE. As Emma had mentioned, much of our work is grounded in research. And so through our guided and funded research at NEFE, we as a policy and advocacy team can go into the field and elevate these findings. And similar to the convenings that I mentioned earlier, this really just helps to drive the conversation, expand the conversation, and just elevate effective financial education as a whole. Lastly here, I have a slide of some resources. I believe we'll be sending these links in the chat as well. These are some things that cover a variety of points that we've talked about today that you might find interesting. Of course, we have our interactive policy map on our website, as well as a page on financial education requirements that are already in place. These are, interactive maps that you might find interesting and can give a little insight into the legislation that we were talking about earlier. 2 points on here, CEE's survey of the states, as well as Champlain College's Center for Financial Literacy, their national report card on high school financial literacy. These are 2 documents that are incredibly valuable. I highly recommend if you're looking to learn more about your state or maybe a neighboring state, or you're just curious about kind of the landscape that we had talked about earlier. These are deep dives that look more at the specifics. Of course, our white paper is focusing on 4 states specifically. These report cards kind of give some more details at a granular level on what is happening in every state. So highly recommend those. FinEd 50 is a coalition that NEFE is a founding member of. We are a part of that consists of different members, different member organizations, some in the private space, some nonprofit, with the common goal of expanding financial education graduation requirements to all 50 states. That is a group that does great work, great advocacy work on the ground on all these points, and will be involved in the future. I believe they're also, always looking for new members, and so that's something that maybe your organization might be interested in as well. And lastly, I did want to mention 2 of our biggest and greatest partners in this space, Next Gen Personal Finance and, of course, Jumpstart Coalition. These are 2 groups that do great work, both advocacy work, but also presenting curriculum and resources for teachers. Next Gen Personal Finance, I'm sure many of you are familiar with their curriculum that they have built out and their lesson plans. We hear very positive things from teachers. It's all very accessible and relatively easy to navigate on their website. And so I would recommend taking a look at that if you're interested in looking at an example of some of the curriculum and resources that I mentioned earlier. And similarly, Jumpstart Clearinghouse is a place, when I was talking about curating some of the many existing resources, Jumpstart has had their clearinghouse for a while now, and that is a great place also that we can look at. I think that it could serve as a model for different states and the State Department of Education or their partners in implementation. This is an example of how you might be able to curate resources for your teachers specifically at the state level. So these are just a few resources that I wanted to share. And yeah, that brings us towards the end.
Great. Thank you, Hunter and Emma. We have, I think, about 10 minutes for Q&A. So if we want to close out the PowerPoint presentation, we have several great questions lined up in the Q&A box. I've answered a few just typing, so you can refer to those if you want to see those that have been answered already, but tried to save some for this conversation here. And if we don't get to your question, please know that we usually try to follow up with folks afterwards, because we have several excellent ones and just want to make sure everyone feels their answer or question is answered. So first of all, I will say, from what I can tell from questions, we have a lot of people who are on the ground doing this work with implementation and on the advocacy side as well. So excited to have you all joining this presentation. We also had a plug for Jumpstart's free online teacher professional development in the Q&A. If we could drop that in the chat as well, just so people have that resource in addition to the resources that Hunter just shared. So with that said, let's jump into some questions. So the first question I want to pose to Emma and Hunter is, what is the difference between a financial education standard versus a financial education requirement? Does the California requirement require it to be a standalone course? Is that the difference, or is it something else?
That is a great question. Yes, there's a lot of terms here, so thank you for that question. So the difference between a graduation requirement and a standard is, one is a required course that has to be completed in order for a student to graduate. So that's usually you have to take 3 courses of math, 4 courses of English, things like that. So there are more courses. A standard is usually what the courses are based on, what has to be included in that course in order for it to count, to make students are getting the right information. So a lot of states all have standards already around personal finance, or like they do around every other topic, that is required that students learn these topics, but that it can be integrated into any course. It can be taught in a variety of ways. It's not a specific course. So that's the difference. A graduation requirement is a course requirement. The standard is usually what is based behind these courses and what students have to learn. California is a standalone requirement, so that their courses going forward have to be a standalone course. That is a great thing for California, but it's a little different from the course versus standard issue. I hope that helped.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Perfect. The next question I want to pose to this group is one we hear all the time. And I think it's a big question about the implementation, which is, we're hearing from our state superintendents concern about finding qualified instructors to teach this. How are other states handling this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that we have seen that, I might have mentioned this earlier, that social study teachers, math teachers who have different backgrounds, different specialties in that, are more or less similarly qualified to be teaching this material after they're trained. So I think the professional development part is important there. But there are also a lot of teachers that are interested in this. They think that it's important as long as they have the proper supports. I'm not sure which state you're in. I know that there is definitely high demand for trained teachers for this course. And so I think really just understanding that there's a wide variety of teachers who are capable of doing it as long as they go through professional development. That's an important place to start. I don't know if Emma has anything else to add.
No, that's a great answer. Yeah, I think a lot of states are looking at how they can redeploy their teachers with the proper training and resources.
And Hunter, I was just going to clarify, when you said they find social studies and math teachers have similar outcomes, do you mean like when that has been studied, that background, once they have received personal finance training, they have similar outcomes with those 2 different backgrounds? I just want to make sure I understand what your first point was.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, and the only thing I would add is, and this will be highlighted in the position papers, we've seen some states, and I'll specifically call out North Carolina here, where the State Department of Ed has partnered with a nonprofit to roll out teacher professional development and training. In this case, it was North Carolina's Council for Economic Education, and they have done excellent jobs putting together institutes, training teachers on this particular subject matter expert, and have even rolled out sort of monthly webinars to supplement those overall institutes. So we're seeing a lot of partnerships come together to fill this gap. So just wanted to chime in with that. Perfect. All right. Next question. So what tools or processes are schools using to teach about this? Specifically, a tool used to help students learn about budgeting, tracking their expenses, debt payoff tracking, etc. Do any of these requirements indicate that a specific tool be used or a tool at all?
Most legislation is very vague on what exactly tool to use to teach these. A lot of the bills put in what they would like to be taught. They want students to learn budgeting, credits, loans, insurance, investing, those kind of topics. So they will often list the topics, but they won't list exactly how to do it. And a lot of that often comes back down to a lot of states have a very local control on their education system. So this is usually left to the state boards, or even more left to districts to decide what is the best tool. So I will give that of like, there isn't usually a lot of guidance on the tool. And as Hunter mentioned, there are a lot of tools out there that are great. And I will let him elaborate more on specific tools.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I mentioned Next Gen Personal Finance is one that comes up a lot, and there are similar resources like that online. One thing I will offer is just that from what I've heard, especially from educators, is that engaging with students on some of these topics requires like a higher level almost of like gamification, or just something that can really get them engaged. And that's why when I talk about flexibility for teachers, that part of it is so important, because a lot of students, if you're just talking the abstract about some of these things, it can be hard to get them to engage. But if you bring examples to them where, you know, they're setting up budgets or playing a small business owner or something, those are ways that teachers can effectively engage with them on some of the topics. So that's not as much an answer about a specific tool, but it is a strategy that we've heard a lot about and I think has been effective.
Thank you both. Next question, this might be our last one, depending on how long the answer takes, but do you have any data on what graduation requirements, if any, were given up by states in order to require personal finance?
So most states did not change their overall graduation requirement. If they had 22 credits to graduate, they still have 22 credits in order to graduate. What most states did is that it replaced an elective. So instead of having 7 credits for an elective that they have to take before they graduate, now they have 6.5. That is the most common. It often could be an elective or replace a higher level math course. So instead of having to take Algebra 2 or something higher, they could take personal finance instead and count towards those math credits as well for graduation. So usually it was a replacement, not a addition.
Thank you, Emma. All right, I think we have time for one last question and then we'll close out. So this is something that comes up a lot, so I wanted to highlight this question, which is limitations on funding was mentioned. Is this the case for California, or was funding attached when requirements passed this year?
California put in a small amount of funding to help with curriculum development and some resources for teachers, but it is a small, I believe it's around $300,000, which in the state of California is not a lot of money. So there was a small amount of money attached to help the curriculum and it to get started, but nothing for like long-term professional development or teacher training.
All right, well, thank you, Hunter. Thank you, Emma. This was great. For attendees, thank you so much for attending and for your questions. We really appreciated the engagement, and we'll be following up with folks who have outstanding questions in the Q&A. Please keep a lookout for more webinars from NEFE in 2025. We have a full schedule planned, and we're excited to roll those out. And following this webinar, we will be sending out the recording along with some other resources. So we appreciate you all joining us today, and we'll close the webinar out. Thank you all.
Thank you.